Racism doesn't always begin with violence. Sometimes it starts with something smaller. When a group of white men rolled into Marcus Tate's block, they thought they were in control. They mocked the music, shoved an elder, and sized Marcus up as nothing more than a fat, quiet, black man. But what they didn't see was a former Delta Force operator who had survived wars they'd only read about. They thought he would stay silent. What happened next wasn't just a fight. It was the spark that turned a forgotten block into a movement. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. On Saturday afternoons, the neighborhood came alive in a way that couldn't be measured by noise alone. It was felt. Music floated from porches like perfume, rich with the sounds of old-school soul, classic R&B, and the occasional splash of gospel harmonies. Somewhere down on Cedar and Pine, somebody's cousin always had a Bluetooth speaker turned a little too high. Marvin Gaye crooning into the breeze while the beat of spades on card tables set a familiar rhythm. Laughter spilled over stoops, where elders sat in lawn chairs beneath wide straw hats, one foot tapping, one hand fanning away the heat and the stories that always came with it. Kids darted in and out of sprinkler arcs in bare feet, their shrieks high and joyous. Bikes clattered along the sidewalk, spokes glinting under the late-day sun, as the scent of grilled meat curled through the air like an invisible thread tying the block together. Somewhere past the corner, someone was arguing playfully over dominoes, while the corner store's old brass bell jingled with each person walking in or out, grabbing grape sodas or frozen treats, and catching up on who'd been where and what news was worth repeating. Mr. Ellis stood behind the counter like he always had, his voice a steady mix of dry humor and subtle warnings, the kind only someone who'd known the whole street since '82 could deliver without raising suspicion or stirring offense. The houses were old but solid, their porches worn smooth from generations of elbows and stories, their railings flaking paint not from neglect, but from time itself. Murals brightened alley walls, honoring black musicians, war veterans, civil rights leaders, and neighborhood grandmothers who raised more children than the census ever counted. The block, like the people living on it, was layered, weathered, and deeply rooted. Not perfect, but proud in a way that didn't need to be said aloud. Among all this quiet movement sat Marcus Tate, known as Big Mark to just about everybody, leaning back in a heavy folding chair outside his auto shop, with the posture of a man who understood how to carry weight, both on his body and in his spirit. The heat didn't seem to bother him. His shoulders, broad as the hood of a Crown Vic, were relaxed, and his eyes followed the flow of the neighborhood the way someone reads a familiar book for the 5th or 6th time, not looking for surprises, just making sure nothing had changed without permission. He was a large man, heavy in the midsection now, his overalls unbuckled and hanging at his waist to reveal a sweat-darkened black tank top clinging to the muscles that hadn't gone soft beneath the size. His hands, thick-knuckled and scarred, cradled a cold bottle of root beer, the kind he liked after a long day of changing tires and tuning busted engines, though the way he sat, unmoving yet deeply aware, suggested a stillness that wasn't laziness, but restraint. There was a quietness to Mark that made people tread carefully around their assumptions. Most only knew him as a mechanic, the one who fixed their transmissions without overcharging, and occasionally slipped a few bucks to the kids selling candy bars for school trips. But those who paid closer attention might have noticed the way he walked. Steady, calculated, like a man who used to move through rooms where a wrong step meant a body count. They might have wondered about the way he scanned intersections before crossing, or how his hands sometimes closed into fists just before a loud bang, even when it was just a firecracker or a car backfiring. He was black, broad, and easy to misjudge, especially to those who didn't know that once upon a time he had worn a different uniform, answered to a different name, and had trained for missions that never made the news. Those chapters had ended long ago, sealed away like the medals in the drawer he never opened, but the instincts remained, pressed into his bones like fingerprints left by fire. He had no interest in returning to that life, not unless someone forced his hand. The day had been a good one, the kind of good that didn't make headlines, just memories, the kind worth protecting, but good never lasted forever. The trucks came in slow, dragging their weight up the street like they were rolling out a warning. The engines weren't just loud, they were aggressive, revving hard at each stop sign, lifting small clouds of dust that curled up and settled on the porches. 3 of them, oversized pickup trucks riding high on modified suspensions, their bodies covered in scratches and bumper stickers that made no attempt at subtlety. One flew the Confederate flag, bold and sun-faded. Another bore a design with a skull split by a coiled snake, the symbol of a group few on the block had ever named aloud, but knew by reputation alone. The third was matte black, its windows dark and uninviting. No plates visible, only the deep rumble of its engine filling the space where music had been playing just moments before. Conversation thinned, not from panic, but from recognition. Music lowered, not silenced, but softened, as if the block itself was holding its breath. Children stopped running. Spades players looked up from their cards. A pair of teenagers paused their rap freestyle mid-rhyme. Eunice Hawkins, walking home from the corner store with a small bag of greens, froze on the curb with one hand tightening around her cane. Marcus's gaze lifted with no urgency, but with full attention. The trucks weren't lost. They weren't passing through. They were circling. Each one slowed at the center of the block, where the porch steps met the sidewalk, where the laughter had been strongest, where the music still played, now quieter, more defiant. Engines idled like beasts waiting to pounce. Doors opened with heavy, deliberate weight. Boots touched the ground, worn and dusted, and too clean to belong to anyone who'd worked a real day in this neighborhood. The men who stepped out weren't boys playing dress-up. They were hard-eyed, sunburned, and swaggering with the kind of confidence that came from thinking the law was on their side, or, worse, didn't apply to them. They stood shoulder to shoulder, 6 of them, arms crossed or hanging by their sides, chins tilted as they surveyed the porches with casual contempt. No words yet, just presence, just that thick, stifling air that comes before a storm. The street didn't speak back. Not yet. But Marcus sat forward just enough to ease his bottle onto the concrete beside his boot, his fingers uncurled. His eyes, sharp beneath the softness of his face, fixed on the trucks and the men who'd brought them. They had come expecting fear. What they didn't know, what they couldn't yet see, was that they had parked themselves in the wrong place, and they had no idea who they were staring at. The silence that settled over the block wasn't full. It was tense, pulled tight at the seams like something about to split. The 6 men stood in formation without forming a line, each one angling his stance as if to claim more space than necessary, their eyes sweeping the block not with curiosity, but possession. They weren't interested in conversation or introduction. They had come for something else entirely. A performance, a confrontation, a display. The first to speak was a heavy-set man in a sleeveless camo shirt, his pale arms covered in old ink that looked like it had been carved rather than drawn. He leaned against the open door of the lead truck and raised his voice just enough to carry down the length of the block. "Y'all always this loud on the weekend?" he called, squinting toward the porch with the speaker, where a teenager in a Lakers jersey leaned back in his chair with one leg crossed, eyes narrowed. "Didn't know we drove through a zoo." A couple of the others chuckled, the kind of laugh that didn't require anything to be funny. Another one, thinner, but no less mean-looking, walked slowly toward the sidewalk and clapped his hands together as if gathering attention. His gaze dragged over every porch like a slow, sticky wind. "Music's garbage," he said flatly. "Ain't even music, just noise. No wonder nobody's working." The Bluetooth speaker was shut off with a sudden click. No one moved otherwise, No one answered. The man seemed disappointed. He kicked at a soda can on the curb, watched it clatter, then turned toward a parked sedan and tapped the hood twice with his knuckles like it was for sale. "What's this? A museum for old cars?" Across the street, Miss Eunice stood with her grocery bag tucked under one arm, gripping her cane a little tighter. Her eyes, sharp behind thick bifocals, didn't blink as the man in the camo shirt walked in her direction. She was halfway to her porch, just a few more feet. But now he was in the way. "Well, well," he said, smiling as if they'd been introduced. "Ain't you just a piece of history? Still walking, too." He stepped closer, not quite touching, but close enough that she had to stop. His presence was a wall. She didn't look afraid, just tired of it. Marcus was still seated across the street, elbows on his knees, watching from beneath the brim of his cap. His fingers laced together as he glanced once to his left, once to his right, scanning the block with a calm, patient eye. He had learned long ago to measure the seconds between when something felt wrong and when it truly became dangerous. Every move mattered. Every heartbeat was data. He wasn't afraid, hadn't been afraid in a long time. But he had hoped, truly hoped, that it wouldn't come to this. The thin one moved next, walking past Miss Eunice toward the front steps of a nearby porch where 3 teenagers sat. 2 boys and a girl, none older than 17. He pointed a finger, casual and slow, toward the girl's curls, then laughed without explanation. "Didn't know poodles came in brown," he said, and his friends roared behind him. The teens didn't move. The older boy tensed visibly, jaw set. But the girl shook her head once, barely, and he stayed in his seat. Then, without warning, the camo-shirted man brushed past Miss Eunice, just hard enough for her to lose her balance. The cane slipped. The grocery bag hit the ground. The man didn't even turn around. He kept walking like she was nothing, like he hadn't touched her at all. And that was the moment. Marcus stood. He rose, slow, steady, without a word, and crossed the street as naturally as if he were going to buy a soda from Mr. Ellis. He didn't shout, didn't rush, just walked. A large black man with broad shoulders, thick arms, and a face that carried no expression at all. There was no announcement, no introduction. But every eye on the block turned to him, including the men who had come to intimidate. By the time he reached Miss Eunice's side, she had already picked up her cane. He bent without speaking and gathered the grocery bag in one hand, checked to make sure nothing had broken, then looked to her. "You all right, ma'am?" he asked, voice low. "I'm fine," she said, her voice clear, chin lifted. "Wasn't nothing but a breeze." Marcus nodded once and gently placed the bag back in her grip. Then he turned, slowly, and faced the 6 men. He didn't step toward them. He didn't raise his voice. He simply stood there, taking in each face, one by one, without blinking. "I think y'all said enough," he said. "Might be time to move along." The men didn't respond right away. One of them tilted his head, clearly surprised that anyone had spoken to them like that, especially someone who didn't fit the stereotype they'd come expecting. Marcus didn't look like a cop or a preacher or an activist. He didn't look like a man with authority. But something about him, the way he stood, the calm in his voice, the way the entire block had gone quiet behind him, made them hesitate. The camo-shirted man narrowed his eyes. "You the welcoming committee?" "No," Marcus replied. "Just someone who lives here." The silence stretched. Then the thin one smirked. "Big man thinks he's got something to say," he muttered. Marcus didn't flinch. He didn't move. He simply kept his eyes locked on the group. There was no anger in them. No fear either. Just a quiet warning. "This block ain't yours," he said. "Not today. Not ever. So if you're smart, you'll turn those trucks around and go find someplace else to pretend you matter." The men stared. The engines still idled. The weight of decision hovered like humidity. The neighborhood waited, and Marcus didn't move an inch. For a moment, the street felt suspended in time. Still, breathless, a block of eyes waiting to see what would happen next. The only sound was the low grumble of the idling engines, steady like distant thunder. The 6 men stood with postures made for performance, puffed up by history, arrogance, and the mistaken belief that intimidation always worked. The thin one stepped forward, close enough now that the sweat on his neck was visible. He looked Marcus up and down slowly, lips twisting into a smile that didn't touch his eyes. "You're a big one, ain't you?" he said, voice laced with amusement and mockery. "Figured you'd be one of the quiet ones. Guess even bears got teeth." Marcus didn't answer. He didn't have to. The block had gone so quiet that even the hum of cicadas felt intrusive. Behind him, teenagers watched from stoops, elders stood in silence, and Mr. Ellis leaned in his doorway. Not moving, but not blinking either. "Must be something in the fried chicken around here," the man continued, louder now, drawing laughter from one of his buddies. "Got y'all feeling bold." Marcus's jaw didn't tighten. His breathing didn't change, but something behind his eyes had settled. Not rage, but resolution. He knew this rhythm. He'd seen it in other places, under other flags. This was the moment when men who thought they couldn't lose tried to provoke a reaction, certain they'd win whatever came next. "You sure you want to do this?" Marcus asked, his tone calm but clear. "Ain't no awards for getting beat in front of an audience." The man didn't get a chance to reply. He swung first, a quick, hard right hook aimed at Marcus's jaw, fast enough to impress someone who didn't know better. But Marcus wasn't someone who didn't know better. He leaned back just enough for the punch to miss, then stepped in and brought his open palm up under the man's chin with a force that snapped his head backward. The man staggered, legs wobbling. Before he could reset, Marcus pivoted, seized his shirt, and drove him face first into the hood of the nearest truck. The impact rang out like a dropped engine block. 2 others rushed him at once, emboldened by their friend's fall, and the fight began in earnest. Marcus moved with the kind of precision that could only come from years of training honed in places far from home. Deliberate, efficient, controlled. He didn't throw wild punches or grunt through anger. He struck like a man who knew every part of his own body could be a weapon if used right. The first man reached for Marcus's arm. Marcus used the momentum against him, ducking low and driving his shoulder into the man's ribs, lifting him off his feet and slamming him hard into the pavement with a crunch of gravel and a cry of pain. The second tried to come in high, swinging a chain he'd pulled from his belt loop. Marcus caught it mid-swing, yanked him forward, and delivered a quick, brutal elbow to the side of his neck that sent him reeling. "Y'all picked the wrong block," Marcus said, low and even, not for theatrics, but as a simple statement of fact. Behind him, the third man approached with a crowbar, clearly realizing fists weren't going to be enough. Marcus turned in time, eyes locking onto the weapon, and ducked the first swing by a fraction. He stepped in fast, kicked the man's knee out from under him, and struck upward with a driving uppercut that cracked the man's nose and sent the crowbar skittering across the asphalt. They were yelling now. Not coordinated, not in control. Calling him names between their attacks, names that had been used for generations as weapons before fists were ever thrown. "Fat boy think he's special. Back off, boy. This ain't your fight." Marcus didn't respond with words. He responded by stepping forward again, gripping one of the attackers by the collar and slamming him backward into the side of the truck so hard the panel dented. The block roared to life behind him, not with noise, with presence. Doors opened. Phones were out. People moved to the sidewalk. No one stepped in. Not yet, but they were there. A wall of witnesses no badge could silence. No lie could erase. They saw it. They saw him. And they saw every man who tried to hurt someone and failed. The last of the 6 men, the one with the skull tattoo curling over his collarbone, pulled something from his waistband. It wasn't a gun, but it gleamed. A long folding knife, blade snapping out with a wicked click. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He shifted his stance slightly, hands up, not out of fear, but preparation. "You sure about that?" he asked, nodding toward the weapon. The man sneered, circling like he had something left to prove. "I don't care who you think you are," he spat. "You don't belong here. You're just another loud—" The blade slashed forward. Marcus sidestepped, caught the man's wrist, twisted, and dropped him in one clean, brutal motion. The knife clattered to the pavement. Marcus planted a boot on the man's chest and looked up at the others. Breath slow, not winded, not shaken. "You were saying?" They didn't answer. Not because they couldn't, but because for the first time since stepping out of those trucks, the men who had arrived so sure of their power were realizing they had misjudged the entire block. And more than that, they had misjudged the man standing in the middle of it. Marcus stepped off the man beneath his boot, just as the one with the broken nose lunged at him from the side, shouting something half-coherent and blood-choked. A wild swing aimed at Marcus's ribs. The punch landed hard, solid and unexpected, the kind that would have dropped most men his size. Marcus grunted, the pain blooming across his side like a hot ripple. But he didn't fall. Instead, he pivoted off the impact and drove his shoulder into the man's sternum, lifting him briefly off his feet before slamming him down into the hood of the truck with a hollow thud that silenced the crowd for a moment. He turned, too slow this time, and another fist cracked across his jaw, snapping his head to the side. The taste of metal filled his mouth, blood bright and sudden on his tongue. One of the others had circled back in, landing the hit just right, probably thinking the weight would slow Marcus down. And to be fair, it hurt. His vision doubled for half a second, pain flaring behind his left eye. The concrete wavered beneath him, but then the ground leveled again. His knees didn't buckle. He took a step forward, and for the first time since the fight started, the gang flinched. "You think fat means soft?" Marcus said through clenched teeth, voice quiet but full of heat. "Y'all brought fists to a place that survived fire." The man who'd hit him backed away, just a step, but it was enough. Marcus followed, not fast, but steady, controlled. He wasn't fighting like someone defending pride. He was fighting like someone defending home. There was no wasted movement. Every strike came from the core, efficient and heavy, aimed with precision, landing with intent. He moved like a man who had trained for decades to end fights quickly and move on to the next threat, but they kept coming. One of the younger ones rushed him again, screaming now, swinging a length of pipe pulled from the truck bed. Marcus stepped inside the arc of the swing, caught the man's wrist against his shoulder, and used his body's turn to disarm him. The pipe dropped with a clatter. Marcus trapped the man's elbow and drove him backward into the pavement, pinning him with a knee to the chest. Another took the distraction as an opening and charged from behind. Marcus turned just in time to absorb the full weight of a tackle. The breath knocked out of him as he was driven back against the side of a truck, ribs grinding against metal. The impact stunned him long enough for fists to hammer his midsection. Not wild punches, but practiced strikes. This one had some experience. Marcus felt the bruise forming before the third hit landed. But pain was familiar. Pain sharpened things, and when the man cocked back for a fourth punch, Marcus slammed his forehead forward, not with anger, but accuracy, catching the man right between the eyes. Bone struck bone. The attacker crumpled with a gasp, holding his face. Marcus didn't stop. He turned, blood now running from the corner of his mouth, ribs aching, knuckles raw, and faced the two remaining upright, the one with the skull tattoo, and the last man, shorter but stockier, eyes darting now, less sure than he had been a few minutes ago. "Go," Marcus said, voice low, his chest heaving with heat and effort. "Ain't nobody here scared of you. You leave now, or you crawl." The man with the tattoo stepped forward anyway, fury overtaking fear. He kicked at the fallen knife and caught it with his heel, sending it skidding back toward him. The blade didn't gleam now. It was wet from the street, dulled by blood and grit. He bent to grab it, and Marcus moved. He covered the distance before the man's fingers touched the handle. His foot came down hard on the man's hand, pinning it to the ground with all his weight behind it. A crack followed, not the knife, but something in the wrist. The man screamed and rolled back, cradling his arm, eyes wide with something that finally resembled clarity. The last man didn't wait. He turned, ran to the driver's side of the lead truck, and jumped in, slamming the door behind him with a jolt. One by one, the others dragged themselves back, limping, cursing, bleeding, and stumbled toward their trucks without the swagger they'd arrived with. No more smirks, no more slurs, just the sound of engines roaring to life, the scramble of tires trying to grip pavement slick with dust and shame. The trucks peeled off, one after the other, bumpers scraping as they hit the end of the block and took the turn too fast. Exhaust coughed from their tailpipes, hanging in the air like a last insult. But the block didn't move. No one shouted. No one chased. They just stood in silence, watching them go. Watching Marcus stand in the middle of the street, still catching his breath, still bleeding from the corner of his mouth, chest rising and falling slow but steady. Mr. Ellis stepped out of his shop doorway, wiping his hands on a rag and shaking his head once. "Didn't know you still had all that in you, Mark," he said quietly. Marcus didn't answer. He wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his hand, turned his head just enough to spit, then looked up at the sky for a long, measured moment, and the block exhaled. Not because the danger had passed, but because the truth had arrived. They had seen it now. All of them. The weight Marcus carried wasn't just in his frame. It was in his training, his history, his silence. The kind of strength that didn't ask for recognition, but would not allow harm. He had defended them. And the world, the trucks, the men, the threats that always came wrapped in laughter, had been pushed back. But night was coming, and Marcus knew the fight was far from over. In the hours that followed, the block felt stretched, not broken, but changed in a way that no one had words for. The sun lowered in the sky, pouring long golden shadows across porches and sidewalks, catching on dented bumpers and the scattered remains of a fight no one could unsee. The teenagers who'd frozen earlier began to speak in hushed voices, trading half-laughs and wide-eyed glances. Elders clutched their card decks tighter, some still pretending to shuffle. Phones buzzed with shared videos already circulating in quiet neighborhood group chats. No one celebrated out loud, but the energy shifted. Cautious pride mixed with a familiar undercurrent of fear. Miss Eunice sat on her front steps, groceries finally brought inside, cane resting across her lap. Her expression was unreadable, but her fingers drummed against the wooden rail in a slow, deliberate rhythm. She hadn't said much since Marcus helped her back across the street, but when Janelle Tate arrived and knelt beside her with a pitcher of water, she finally broke the silence. "Your brother," she said, voice steady. "He held it together for us, but I hope he knows what that means." Janelle didn't answer right away. She looked down the street to where Marcus was back at the garage, sitting alone beside a pile of scrap parts that hadn't moved since morning. He hadn't gone inside, hadn't cleaned himself up. He just sat, hands resting on his knees, eyes unfocused, as if somewhere deeper than anyone could follow. His lip was swollen. His shirt was torn at the collar. One knuckle was split and still bleeding faintly. Some waved to him as they passed, unsure what to say. Some walked past with heads down, grateful, but afraid of what might come next. Because everyone knew what happened when you humiliated men like that. Men who came looking for power and left crawling. There was always a return, and Marcus knew it too. Still, the next day, he went back to work, like nothing had happened. He showed up early, unlocked the garage, turned the radio low, and set about fixing a cracked radiator for Miss Dolores's Hyundai. His movements were stiff but focused. He worked with one arm favoring the other, but didn't complain. When Deshawn came by and offered to help carry a box of brake pads, Marcus didn't say no, just nodded once and let him do it. He didn't talk about the fight. Didn't brag, didn't explain, but the whispers didn't stop. By mid-afternoon, 2 local teens had recreated part of the scene on TikTok, mimicking the attacker's retreat to laughter and awe. At the same time, a few older residents met behind closed doors at the community center, whispering about how to prepare in case those trucks came back. Some wanted cameras installed. Others talked about legal channels, petitions, watch groups, but no one had illusions. They'd seen the looks on those men's faces. This wasn't over. And that night, the block changed again. It began with the graffiti, thick black spray paint across the front of the corner store's outer wall. A crooked symbol no one needed explained. A distorted cross overlaid with jagged letters, some version of a swastika. The words, "Know your place," scrawled beneath it in drips that hadn't even dried by the time Mr. Ellis discovered it. Then came the gunshots. It was after midnight. Most homes were dark, lights flickering only in bedrooms where sleep came slow. Marcus had just finished rinsing the blood from his knuckles at the bathroom sink when the first shot cracked through the air. Then a second. Sharper. Closer. The shots hit the house 3 doors down, shattering 2 front windows and punching holes through the porch railing. No one was hit, but the family inside, a mother and her 2 sons, hit the floor screaming, glass raining down around them like a second storm. Sirens didn't come, neighbors called, lines rang, dispatch took statements, offered the usual reassurance, "We'll send a unit when available." But no one came, not that night, not even when Marcus stood in the street beneath the broken window, holding up a piece of shell casing in his hand as proof. He watched the flashing red digits of the family's alarm clock through the ruined window and waited for the blue and white to appear. They never did. By dawn, the graffiti had spread. A crude drawing across the community center's back wall. More symbols along the sidewalk near Marcus's garage. The air felt different, sour with threat, heavy with expectation, and still no police. Janelle showed up at the garage with a bucket and paintbrush. "I'm not asking," she said when Marcus opened his mouth to object. "You fix cars. I paint walls. Let's get it done." They worked in silence, her brush swiping thick over the slurs, his hammer pounding nails back into the sign the gang had tried to tear down. People began to gather, not a crowd, but enough. Neighbors swept glass. Teens pulled trash bags from Mr. Ellis's stockroom. Someone brought donuts. But Marcus said little. He knew what this was. Retaliation wasn't just violence. It was control. Fear was a weapon just as powerful as fists. They hadn't come back in person, not yet. But they wanted the message to land all the same. Later that afternoon, a patrol car finally arrived. Not because anyone called again, but because someone higher up must have realized silence had gone on too long. Officer Reed Nolan stepped out of the cruiser, the same tight-lipped white cop who always seemed to appear when the department needed a buffer, but not a solution. He looked at the painted-over graffiti, at the boarded windows, at the people staring. "We're aware of the situation," he said, hands on his belt. "It's under review." His voice wasn't apologetic. It wasn't even defensive. It was the voice of someone who'd said those words before. Practiced, polished, detached. The kind of tone meant to give the appearance of control without offering any real action. Officer Reed Nolan let his eyes scan the crowd, but never settled too long on any one face, especially not Marcus's. But Marcus was already moving, slow and deliberate, walking toward the patrol car with the kind of ease that made people pay attention. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't posture. He just stepped close enough that Nolan had to shift, his jaw tightening beneath the neatly trimmed line of his beard. "You knew they were coming, didn't you?" Marcus said. Not a question, but a truth laid bare. Nolan blinked once, too slow, then gave a tight shrug. "I don't know what you mean." Marcus tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing not in anger, but in study. He'd seen this dance before. Not in this uniform, maybe, but in a dozen others. Men who thought a badge, a title, or a uniform made them untouchable. Men who thought silence meant control. They came through 2 counties, Marcus said evenly. Flags out, tags showing. No patrols intercepted. No warning from local units. And now there's shell casings on the sidewalk. Hate symbols across half the block. And you show up 20 hours later with, "It's under review." Like that's supposed to mean something. Nolan didn't flinch, but he didn't reply either. He shifted again, the toe of his boot dragging a small half-circle into the dust by the tire. "I was told to check in," he said finally. "Not to help," Marcus replied. "Not to investigate, just to check in." A muscle jumped in Nolan's cheek. "Let the process play out." Marcus didn't smile. He leaned in just slightly, his voice dropping. "I've seen what happens when good people wait on broken systems. The process ain't going to save you if you're standing on the wrong side of it when this blows open." He stepped back without another word, turned his back to the cruiser, and walked away. Not fast, not loud, but final. Nolan stayed by the door for a moment longer, watching him go, before getting back in the car and driving off, leaving behind nothing but tire lines and questions that were starting to multiply. Marcus didn't waste time. That night, after the last porch light blinked out, and the block fell into that tense kind of quiet that only comes when people pretend to sleep, he pulled out the battered notebook from beneath his bed, the one he hadn't touched in years. Its pages were filled with names, numbers, coded call signs, and short phrases that only meant something to men who had served in shadows. He turned to a page marked Recon Domestic and ran his thumb along a scribbled line that read, "For when they bring the war home." He opened his laptop. The security software he installed after retirement was still intact, military-grade encryption, virtual tunnels masking his activity. He moved through it quickly, fingers recalling the old keys, the rhythm of caution and necessity. The license plates had been visible. One of the neighbors, Deshawn, probably, had sent Marcus photos the moment the trucks peeled off. He enlarged the grainy image of the lead vehicle's rear plate, ran it through a few search tools only his old unit would have known about, and waited. The hit came back flagged, registered to a dummy LLC out of Missouri, a shell company linked to 2 other plates, one of which had surfaced 6 months ago at a militia rally in northern Alabama. Same truck model, different flag, same driver's build. Marcus's eyes narrowed. He typed again, digging deeper, cross-referencing every piece with names from a separate file he hadn't touched in almost a decade. A private list maintained after his discharge, mostly out of instinct. Half of them were dead. The other half had disappeared into parts of the country where cameras didn't reach, and flags flew backward. He paused on one name, Royce Tatum, a known white supremacist linked to multiple illegal arms shipments after the Gulf conflict, dishonorably discharged, disappeared 5 years ago. Last known appearance, a closed-door survivalist conference in Montana. No confirmed sightings since. But the truck plate had once been registered to a garage in a town just 30 minutes from Marcus's block, a garage shut down 2 years ago under a different name. The pieces were starting to connect. He picked up his phone and called a number he hadn't dialed in years. It rang 6 times before a voice answered, low and rough, unmistakably military. "This better be good," the man said. "It's Mark," he replied. "I need a favor. Quiet. Quick. I'm dealing with something that doesn't feel small." There was silence on the other end. Then a slow breath. "How bad?" "They came into my block like they owned it," Marcus said. "But they weren't just here to scare people. They were testing something." The voice exhaled again. "I'll see what chatter I can find." "You still have access to the Phoenix net?" "I never let it go." "Then you know what you're stepping into." "I do," Marcus replied. "I just don't think they know who they stepped to." He hung up, leaned back in his chair, and stared at the screen. Red strings of text scrolled by. Dates, locations, files flagged for shipment. All of it pointed to something bigger than local intimidation. Guns were moving, people were being activated, and someone, maybe even Officer Nolan, was helping them do it under the radar. Marcus sat in that quiet for a long time, fingers hovering over the keys, the distant echo of boots from another life pounding in his memory. He had tried to leave that world behind, had laid down the weight of violence in exchange for grease-stained overalls and peace, but they had come anyway. And now they had his attention. The next morning arrived in pieces, gray sky, restless wind, and a silence that wasn't peace, but something more like expectation. Marcus didn't bother opening the shop. The closed sign stayed hanging in the window as he made his way toward the old train yard at the far edge of the neighborhood. No one asked him where he was going, but a few watched from porches as he passed. Quiet nods acknowledging what they didn't need explained. The yard had once been the neighborhood's lifeline. Decades back, freight moved through here every other day, hauling goods to and from the ports, stacking steel on steel like veins pumping through the country's heart. But the rail traffic dried up long ago, and now the place was more weeds and rust than function. The city had let it sit untouched, surrounded by a sagging fence and broken signs warning about trespassing. Kids used it to sneak around curfew. Teens tagged walls with spray paint. But lately, even they had stayed away. Marcus stepped through a bent section of the fence and moved slow, boots crunching gravel, as his eyes scanned the empty cars and derailed boxcars that hadn't moved in years. It didn't take long before he saw it, just past the third siding, tucked behind an abandoned control shack, half swallowed by vines and shadow. A long black duffel bag, half buried under a tarp that wasn't there a week ago. He knelt, brushed it clear, unzipped it in silence. Inside were weapons, not the kind you bought at a pawn shop, or from a redneck survivalist looking to arm a militia. These were military-grade, clean and oiled. 2 M4 carbines, a modified shotgun with a tactical light, ammunition packed in rows, a hardened case with high-capacity magazines, still sealed in plastic. No serial numbers, no dust, no chance they'd been here long. Marcus stood, looked around slowly, and exhaled through his nose. This wasn't hate spray-painted on a church door. This was preparation. This was a war chest. And somebody thought they'd have time to come back for it. He didn't have time to call anyone before the sound of tires crunching over gravel reached him. A pickup truck, same make and model as the ones from earlier that week, crawled around the edge of the yard, its front bumper bent from a recent hit. One man behind the wheel, alone. Marcus didn't move. He stood near the shack with the duffel still open, arms at his sides. The driver killed the engine, stepped out slowly, and closed the door with too much care. Tall, lean, late 20s maybe, with the kind of sunburned skin that came from too many hours on the road, and not enough conscience. His belt sagged slightly on his hips, the butt of a handgun visible beneath a flannel shirt. "Well now," he said, drawing the words out like he thought they had weight. "Didn't expect to see you here. Thought y'all were too busy licking wounds to come poking around." Marcus didn't reply. He just turned his body enough to block the duffel from view, his hands still empty, but his stance shifting, slightly forward, balanced, ready. "You left something behind?" Marcus said. The man laughed. "Ah, you one of them cleanup types? Trying to keep the block nice for the cameras?" Marcus took a step forward. "You left a bag full of felonies. That don't strike me as sloppy. That strikes me as planned." The man shrugged. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. And then he reached, not fast, but with practiced confidence, for the grip of the handgun under his shirt. He didn't make it. Marcus moved first, a blur of muscle and muscle memory, closing the distance in 2 long strides. He struck the man's wrist with a downward slap, forcing the gun sideways before it could clear the holster. The second blow hit the man's ribs, sharp and fast, followed by a sweep of the leg that sent him crashing to the ground. The gun skidded across the gravel. Marcus didn't go for it. He went for the man, pinned him to the ground with a knee to the chest, and pulled a burner phone from the front pocket of his jeans. Black casing, no brand, no stickers. Just a single crack across the screen and a handful of recent notifications. "Tell me who you're working for," Marcus said. The man spat at his boot. Marcus pressed his knee harder. The man gasped, his breath catching. "You don't get it, do you?" he wheezed. "This ain't about you. This ain't just some neighborhood fight. You stepped into something you don't even see yet." Marcus held up the phone. "This'll help me see." The man went still. Not out of fear, but because he understood now that he'd lost control. Marcus could feel the shift. He stood slowly, keeping one eye on the man as he backed away, phone in hand, walking toward the truck. He opened the door, checked the glove box, found a second magazine and a paper map marked with ink lines, travel routes, supply points, what looked like rendezvous spots along rural backroads and state borders. The scope was widening. As he walked back toward the street, the sun now fully overhead and unforgiving, another engine pulled up fast. A cruiser. Officer Nolan again. Alone. He stepped out, eyes sweeping over the yard. "What the hell are you doing here?" he asked. "Cleaning up your mess," Marcus said, holding up the phone. Nolan's eyes went to the man on the ground, then the open duffel, then back to Marcus. His jaw tightened. "This is evidence. You shouldn't—" Marcus stepped close, not threatening but pointed. "You think I don't know what this is? You think I haven't seen this before in places that don't make the news? I'm telling you to back off," Nolan said, voice harder now, a thread of something darker woven in. "This isn't your lane." Marcus's voice didn't rise. "You had your chance to stop this before it started. You didn't. Now it's in my lane." He walked past him without another word. The burner phone sat on Marcus's workbench like a ticking clock, cracked screen glowing dimly under the single overhead bulb in the garage. He hadn't cracked it open yet. Not fully. He knew once he did, there'd be no coming back. For now, it stayed off to the side, ignored only in appearance, while his hands busied themselves with simple labor. A worn alternator disassembled, parts laid out with the precision of a man who needed something predictable in front of him. His mind, though, wasn't in the bolts or grease. It was on the movement gathering quietly behind the scenes. The neighborhood was shifting again, not in panic this time, but in calculation, as though everyone who had once hoped the threat might pass was now preparing for its return. The fear that had kept people on porches and behind curtains had begun to harden into resolve, the kind that didn't look loud or flashy, but moved in quiet steps, in glances passed between neighbors, in locks reinforced, in questions that carried more weight than their wording let on. Bishop Carter was the first to speak plainly, his words not wrapped in scripture or softened by parables, but delivered with the weight of a man who had seen too much not to say something when the silence stretched too far. He found Marcus on the sidewalk that evening, just as the sun dipped behind the trees and the cicadas began to buzz in their drawn-out chorus. The air was thick with humidity and unspoken questions. The street lamp behind the bishop, casting his white-collared shirt in long, solemn shadows across the pavement. He wasn't carrying his Bible, which Marcus noticed right away, because the bishop never left home without it. The absence wasn't a mistake. It was a message. "Mark," he said, voice low and even, "what you did the other day was righteous, but be careful. Righteous don't always mean wise." Marcus didn't stop walking. He didn't need to. He gave the bishop a long look, steady and unreadable. Not disrespectful, but not deferential either. The kind of look that said he'd heard the words before they were spoken, but wasn't ready to accept them yet. "We got shot at, Bishop," he replied with quiet clarity. "Ain't no sermon gonna fix that." The bishop didn't argue. He only nodded once, slowly, the gesture not of agreement, but of understanding, his eyes holding firm in the soft dusk light. "I'm not telling you to do nothing," he said. "I'm asking you to think before you do everything." They stood there for a long moment, neither of them blinking, the distance between them not closed by words, but by the weight both of them carried for a neighborhood they loved differently, but fiercely. "I am thinking," Marcus said finally, his voice measured. And what I'm seeing ain't a one-man job." He turned away without waiting for another reply, his footsteps steady on the cracked sidewalk, and the bishop remained where he stood, eyes lifted slightly, as if watching something above the clouds no one else could see. That same night, Marcus gathered a small group behind the garage, young men and women from the block, people he trusted, not because they looked tough or talked big, but because they paid attention, because they stayed when others fled, because they understood that sometimes protecting a place wasn't about how loud you shouted, but how well you moved in silence. Deshaun was the first to arrive, nerves buzzing beneath the surface like electricity beneath his skin. He didn't ask questions at first, though his eyes were full of them, and his hands trembled slightly. Not out of fear, but from the need to act. The pressure of wanting to be useful while everything around him felt like it could collapse at any moment. Marcus handed him a length of rope and a tire, tools that didn't seem to mean anything at first glance. "First lesson," he said, not unkindly, "work before war." What followed wasn't military training in the way most imagined it. Marcus didn't bark commands. He didn't break them down or rebuild them into soldiers. He showed them how to watch the flow of a street, how to notice a car that drove by too slowly, too often. He taught them how to move quietly when it mattered, how to read a pattern before it broke, how to recognize that sometimes danger didn't arrive with sound, but with stillness. He didn't teach them how to fight. He taught them how not to die. They practiced how to respond to an ambush, not with aggression, but with control. He showed them how to redirect momentum, how to disarm without causing permanent damage, how to use leverage instead of strength. And through it all, he never raised his voice. He spoke only when necessary, and they listened, not because he demanded it, but because there was something in his presence that told them everything he said had already been paid for in scars and silence. "You fight stupid. You get people hurt," he told them one evening, his voice low over the rhythmic sound of fists hitting a padded post. "You move like you're angry. You miss what's coming next. You protect. That's the job." Janelle had been watching from the edge of the garage most nights, saying little, but seeing everything. It wasn't until the fourth night that she stepped inside, the air thick with the smell of oil, sweat, and the kind of tension that didn't come from training alone. Marcus was seated on a low stool, wrapping a fresh cut on his forearm, the skin already bruising from a misstep during a hold demonstration. She crossed her arms as she stood in the doorway, the light catching in her eyes, her expression a mix of frustration and fear. "You said you were done with all this," she said, not softly, not angrily, but with the disappointment of someone who had watched him walk away from the edge once and was now watching him step back toward it. Marcus didn't look up right away. His fingers worked the bandage tighter, pulling the gauze across the wound with a quiet patience. "I was," he finally answered. "And now?" she pressed, taking a step closer. He exhaled through his nose, then nodded once. "Now they brought it to my door." Her voice sharpened. "They brought it to our door, Mark. Mine. Miss Eunice's. The kids on the block. You think training a few folks is gonna stop that? You think putting hands on a few of them is gonna end it? I think it's a start." She moved even closer, the weight of her words growing heavier. "You think you're protecting us, but you're making yourself a target again. And the more you show them who you are, the more they'll come to shut it down. You know that, don't you?" Marcus lifted his eyes to hers, quiet and unwavering. "I ain't hiding who I am anymore." "You never hid it," she snapped, her voice cracking like a whip. "You just finally reminded everybody." The silence that followed didn't loosen. It clung to them, thick and stubborn, filling the air between their breaths. When she finally spoke again, her voice had lowered, but not softened. "You want to fight? Fine, but don't pretend you're the only one who'll bleed for it." That night, after the garage lights went dark and the neighborhood folded into the fragile calm of sleep, a single truck rolled down the street. Slow, almost cautious, its engine idling low like a predator just beyond reach. It didn't stop. It didn't call out. It simply coasted past house after house as if memorizing the layout of lives. Its windows dark, its plates obscured, the sound of its tires no louder than whispers on pavement. Marcus stood on his porch, a wrench still resting in one hand, shoulders square beneath the soft light of the entry lamp. He didn't move. He didn't reach for his phone. He didn't speak. He watched. And, as the truck disappeared into the curve of the block, swallowed by shadow, he felt something tighten inside. Not fear, not anger, but certainty. They were watching now, measuring, waiting. And Marcus, no longer caught between the man he used to be and the one the neighborhood needed, understood that whatever was coming next would not be decided by them. It would be decided by him. The burner phone unlocked without resistance. Once Marcus entered the code he'd found scribbled along the edge of a folded map inside the glove compartment of the captured truck. A 6-digit sequence tied to a specific date that hadn't meant anything to him at first glance, but when he cross-referenced it against past operations, it revealed a deeper connection, one that reached back into his military past. August 12th. It had been the day of a failed militia raid in Tennessee, a day that had gone mostly unnoticed in the national media, but had sent ripples through the veteran underground. Now, in the soft glow of the workbench lamp, that date became the key to a wider conspiracy, unlocking not just messages, but memories Marcus had long buried beneath layers of silence. Inside the device was a stripped-down messaging app, one he recognized from years ago, often used in covert ops when standard encryption wasn't enough. The interface was basic: black background, green text, and strings of usernames without profiles or photos. The messages themselves were terse, loaded with coded language and abbreviations that read like a supply chain disguised as backwoods banter. References to barrels, ink, cans, and flags, placed near coordinates he immediately recognized as distribution routes. These weren't conversations between petty thugs or casual racists. This was infrastructure. This was organization. And buried in one of the threads was a name that didn't belong among the others, a name Marcus hadn't read or spoken in nearly a decade. Raul. The message was brief. Kess approves. Raul wants the next drop timed by sunrise. Keep the freight yard clear. Signed, Tombstone. His breath didn't catch, and his face didn't change, but something in his chest turned. Raul Kessler had served alongside him in Delta Force during one of the longest, most brutal campaigns of Marcus's career. Raul had been precise, calculated, and remorseless, a man who executed orders with surgical efficiency, but lacked the conscience that made soldiers human. Officially, Raul had been declared dead after an explosive raid gone wrong in northern Afghanistan, but Marcus had never accepted the story they were fed. There'd been no body, no footage, no first-hand account from anyone he trusted. Just paperwork, one phone call, and silence. Now, here he was again, not just alive, but orchestrating an arms network across state lines, feeding hate groups like Royce Tatum's gang with the kind of tactical support that only came from someone with high-level training and access. If Raul was involved, this wasn't about ideology. It wasn't even about race. It was about power, cold, systematic, and national in scale. The memories came fast and vivid. Sandstorms swirling through shattered windows, the drone of helicopters overhead, Raul's voice barking coordinates in clipped tones as bullets screamed through narrow alleys. Marcus remembered the night it all began to unravel, how Raul had disappeared for hours during an op that should have taken 30 minutes, how he'd returned without explanation, without backup, and without remorse. That was the night Marcus had stopped trusting him. And now, it seemed, for good reason. Elsewhere, in a part of the county not lit by city lamps or monitored by street cameras, Officer Reed Nolan stood beneath a flickering fluorescent bulb outside a closed-down gas station that had long since become more cover than business. The parking lot was cracked with weeds, the air filled with the smell of stale oil and mud. Leaning against the hood of a dust-covered SUV was Royce Tatum, arms crossed, cigarette dangling from his fingers, boots planted like he owned the ground they stood on. "You didn't say anything about Delta," Royce muttered, his tone dark, not with fear, but with the frustration of someone who knew he'd been outmaneuvered. Nolan's face remained unreadable, though a twitch near his jaw betrayed the tension behind his words. "I didn't know," he lied. The kind of lie told without conviction, the kind of lie that falls apart when held up to daylight. Royce chuckled bitterly, his voice low, the sound more threat than amusement. "You knew enough to keep your hands clean when the block lit up. And you knew where the rail drops were happening. You don't get to play dumb now." Nolan handed him a manila envelope, worn at the edges, with pages detailing new movement paths, routes cleared of patrols, blind spots in regional law enforcement coverage, notes about which jurisdictions could be leaned on and which ones to avoid. "You've got 3 nights. After that, I can't guarantee anything." Royce stepped forward, close enough to smell the starch in Nolan's collar. "You were never guaranteeing anything," he said. "You were just buying time." Back on the south side, Marcus moved through the shadows of the old rail warehouse, the one marked in the messages as a secondary supply point. The outside was covered in graffiti, but the windows had been recently reinforced, and the locks had been changed. Someone was maintaining the place, but only just enough to keep it from collapsing. He approached from the rear entrance and listened. Inside, voices drifted through the hollow interior. 2 men, maybe 3, loading something metallic into crates. Marcus waited for the sound to shift, then slipped inside, hugging the wall, boots silent on worn concrete. He caught the nearest one off guard, dropping him with a precise elbow to the temple before the man could shout. The second reached for a sidearm, but Marcus moved faster, disarming him with a pivot and a hook that sent him crashing into a stack of crates, labeled with stenciled numbers and Russian characters. The man slumped over the crates, didn't move again, his body limp beneath the shattered splinters of wood and dust. Marcus stepped over him with care, sweeping the dim corners of the warehouse with deliberate precision. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't need one. The shadows did most of the work, cloaking his movements as he advanced past rusted catwalks and leaning shelves, where bundles of tarpaulin hung like forgotten bodies suspended in air. He kept his breathing controlled, low and steady, ears tuned to the smallest shifts, voices ahead, deeper now, and the unmistakable sound of crates sliding across concrete. There was a third man. Marcus moved past a row of steel drums stacked too high, all marked with faint military surplus codes that no longer meant anything to the public, but spoke volumes to someone who had served in classified zones. These weren't civilian acquisitions. They weren't old war memorabilia passed from collector to collector. These were operational supplies, stashed with the same care and labeling Marcus remembered from deployments where mistakes got men killed. Someone had rerouted federal-grade equipment, and someone else had repurposed it to arm extremists under the cover of darkness. He found the third man crouched beside a pallet jack, loading ammunition into plastic bins lined with straw and styrofoam. The man moved quickly, efficiently, like he'd done this before. But what caught Marcus's eye wasn't the bullets. It was the map taped to the wall behind him. A stretch of highways and rural counties drawn in red marker, small towns circled, rail junctions marked with times, arrows branching off into state lines like a web with no center. Marcus stepped into view. The man didn't notice until it was too late. By the time he turned, Marcus had closed the gap, wrapped one thick arm around his neck, and dragged him backward into the shadows with a force that silenced any thought of escape. The man thrashed, kicked, tried to elbow back, but Marcus adjusted his grip with surgical precision, cutting off the oxygen just long enough to weaken the fight. When the man finally collapsed, gasping and dazed, Marcus zip-tied his wrists with cord pulled from his pocket and leaned him against the base of the nearest crate. The map on the wall was already burning itself into memory, marked drop points, rotating routes that avoided major interstates, and a symbol in the corner Marcus hadn't seen since his service years. A jagged triangle made of 3 overlapping arrows, once used in covert communications to identify rogue movement divisions during internal investigations. It wasn't a militia symbol, it wasn't a gang mark, it was military-born and buried, repurposed by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. He turned to the man he'd restrained, whose breath was still shallow, chest heaving under the pressure of adrenaline and pain. "You talk," Marcus said, voice low and controlled, "or you don't get out of here." The man laughed, a short, bitter sound, though it ended in a wince of pain. "You think this is just some backwoods crew with a flag and a few guns?" he muttered. "You've got no idea what this really is. I know this route crosses 3 state lines, and it's moving military weapons off record," Marcus replied. "And I know you didn't build this network on your own. You're already too late," the man said, shifting against the crate. "This ain't about you. It never was, but they knew you'd come. That's the part he wanted." Marcus stepped forward. "Who?" The man looked up. The corner of his mouth twisted in a crooked grin, one eye already swelling shut from the earlier scuffle. "You already know," he said. "He's the one who left the door open." That gave Marcus pause. He reached into the man's jacket and retrieved another burner phone, smaller than the last, but still active. No lock screen, no password. Just an open message thread waiting in the background. One text stood out. "If he's half the man he used to be, he'll find this place before midnight. Let him." It was signed. Kess. Marcus didn't say anything. He didn't move for several long seconds. The air around him thickened, not with fear, but with the realization that everything he'd done, the investigation, the raids, the confrontation, had all been part of something designed to happen. It hadn't been reaction. It had been invitation. Raoul had left breadcrumbs, not mistakes. Every crate, every map, every message. It had all been placed just close enough for Marcus to find. He turned back to the captured man. "Where is he?" The man shook his head. "You think he's hiding?" he rasped. "He's waiting." Marcus stood still for another moment, taking in the layout of the warehouse once more before dragging the man to the corner and zip-tying him to a steel beam, ensuring he wouldn't bleed out or disappear before morning. He took photos of the crates, the map, the messages, and sent them to the contact he had reached the night before, the one who owed him favors too old to ignore. Then, without waiting for backup or permission, he left the warehouse and returned to his truck. The drive was silent. No music, no chatter on the radio, just the hum of tires on asphalt and the growing pressure in his chest, not from uncertainty, but from the sharp clarity of what had now become unavoidable. Raoul wasn't simply alive. He wasn't just funding a hate network. He was orchestrating a campaign from within, using his old training and knowledge of infrastructure to bypass scrutiny, to build something too quiet for the government to notice and too violent to ignore once it struck. And worse than that, he had planned for Marcus to find him. The warehouse was still in his rear view, but the weight of it pressed hard on Marcus's shoulders long after the building had disappeared into the distance. The open road offered no clarity, only silence, the kind that didn't soothe, but settled inside his ribs like stone. He had left the restrained man behind, photographs sent, files transferred, and the burner phones already wiped and stored. Yet nothing about it felt like progress. It felt like a warning, and every step forward felt like it had already been predicted. By the time Marcus returned to the block, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting long golden fingers over rooftops and front porches, still dusted with dew. The streets were empty, but the tension had not lifted. It hung between the houses, settled into the foundations. He parked by the garage and sat there for a moment, the engine ticking, his hands resting on the steering wheel, still stained with someone else's sweat and grit. When he finally stepped out, his limbs were heavy, not from exhaustion, but from the growing realization that he was walking into a fight without an end. Every move he made unearthed something bigger. Every answer led to more questions. And Raoul, or Kess as he now called himself, wasn't just 10 steps ahead. He had written the map Marcus was following. Inside the garage, the light buzzed overhead. The air smelled of old rubber and engine oil, familiar and grounding. Marcus dropped his jacket over a stool, sat at the workbench, and pulled out the cracked burner phone again. The last messages were still open. Coordinates embedded in a string of texts, masked as supply reports, but clearly pointing to a location not far from the freight line. A decommissioned agricultural depot that had been abandoned for years, but still appeared on county maps as active logistics. He stared at the coordinates, knowing what they implied before he even confirmed them. This wasn't just about rogue supply drops. These were movements that lined up with outdated but once official government shipping routes. Someone was using knowledge from the inside to move illegal weapons along forgotten veins of federal infrastructure. Someone who had served. Someone who had stayed connected. Someone like Raoul. His head dropped slightly, fingers rubbing the bridge of his nose, as the ache behind his eyes pulsed deeper. He had carried weight before, in combat zones, on missions where the right decision still meant someone didn't come home, but this was different. This wasn't about orders or operations. This was about a neighborhood that had trusted him without knowing why. About people who had seen him fight and decided he was the one who should protect them, even though he'd spent years trying to avoid becoming that man again. He hadn't noticed Janelle enter until she was already beside him, her footsteps soft, her presence unannounced. She didn't speak right away, just watched him for a moment. Her arms crossed loosely, her expression caught somewhere between concern and resolve. "You look like you're waiting to fall apart," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm just tired," Marcus replied, though the words felt too thin, too easy. Janelle stepped closer and rested her hand lightly on his shoulder, the same way their mother used to when they were kids, and she wanted to ground them without saying much at all. "This isn't about finishing them off," she said. "This is about making sure our people wake up tomorrow without fear. It's not vengeance, Mark. It's protection." Marcus nodded slowly, the words sinking in, not because they were new, but because he needed to hear them again, from someone who knew what they meant beyond the strategy and the fire. "They're using military routes," he said, turning the phone screen toward her. "Old ones. Ones they shouldn't even know about. This isn't just a gang with stolen weapons. This is organized, intelligent, and funded by something bigger." She didn't flinch. "So, keep going. But don't carry it like it's just yours to carry." He didn't reply. He just sat there for a moment longer, letting her words settle into the cracks the weight had made. Later that day, while Marcus was loading scrap into the back of the truck, Deshaun appeared near the edge of the driveway. He stood awkwardly at first, shifting his weight from foot to foot, his hands jammed into the pockets of a hoodie 2 sizes too big. When Marcus looked up, the boy stepped forward, his voice low but certain. "I want to learn more," he said. Marcus didn't ask what he meant. He already knew. "Why?" he asked instead. Deshaun shrugged, but it wasn't casual. "Because the next time they come, I don't want to freeze. I don't want to feel like somebody else has to fight for me. You saw what was coming. You didn't wait." Marcus set the crate down slowly, then walked over and leaned against the tailgate. His eyes searched the boy's face, not looking for lies, but for weight, for readiness. "You sure?" "I don't want to just survive," Deshaun said. "I want to protect." Marcus nodded once and clapped him on the shoulder. "Then be here at 7. And bring gloves." That night, Marcus sat with the decrypted files again, tracing the coordinates onto a larger map now spread across the garage floor. He had drawn red lines connecting every known drop point, every warehouse, every confirmed sighting of gang movement. It created a pattern, not a random scatter of violence, but a grid with purpose. The location tied to the latest coordinates was near a government-tagged storage depot, listed in federal inventory as inactive since 2013. The crates there, if still intact, would hold more than weapons. They would hold proof, government labeling, inventory tags, serial numbers that led back to contracts and procurement chains the public wasn't supposed to see. It would be the evidence Marcus needed to expose the network. But more than that, it would be the next breadcrumb Raoul wanted him to find. And as the wind picked up outside the garage and the streetlights flickered into life, Marcus understood the depth of the trap he was walking into. But he also understood that he couldn't turn back now because someone was using his silence, and he was done being silent. The depot sat alone at the end of a broken road where the asphalt crumbled into gravel, and weeds clawed their way through concrete seams. Fenced, padlocked, and marked with a rusted federal seal that had long since faded into the color of decay, the site looked abandoned from a distance. But Marcus knew better. The coordinates didn't lie, and neither did the pattern in the supply chain. He moved quietly through the overgrowth, bypassing the front gate by scaling the west side of the fence where a tree's roots had broken through the concrete, creating an incline just wide enough for a climb. Once inside, he followed the faint tire tracks that had cut through the gravel like scars, leading him around the building's perimeter. The loading bay doors were locked tight, untouched. But the side entrance told a different story. The lock had been snapped and poorly reset, the metal around the latch fresh with scrape marks. Inside, the depot was still and dark, lit only by the soft flicker of a single motion light that sputtered near the ceiling. Rows of racks filled the floor, stacked high with crates in military black wrap, some of them marked with federal procurement tags, some stripped clean of anything traceable. Marcus moved carefully, eyes sweeping across every row, boots silent on dust-coated concrete. He knew what he was looking at even before he opened one. He'd handled shipments like these overseas, seen this exact configuration, this same logistical code system. But these weren't on any active roster. These were rerouted, stolen, maybe, or worse, given freely. As he rounded the far end of a row, past crates marked with faded serial numbers and old defense contractor barcodes, he heard it. A footstep, not loud, but deliberate. Marcus stepped back into the shadow between racks, his breathing steady, his hand already near the grip of the knife clipped beneath his waistband. A figure appeared through the center aisle. Officer Reed Nolan, dressed down in a tactical vest and dark clothing. No badge, no name tag, but every movement screamed training. His hand hovered near his hip. He didn't speak right away. "I figured it'd be you," Nolan said finally, his voice low but edged. Marcus didn't move, but his eyes narrowed. "Coming to clean up the evidence?" he asked. "You shouldn't have followed the trail," Nolan said, taking another step forward. "You weren't supposed to know how deep it went." Marcus stepped into view now, his frame half-shadowed, the overhead light catching only the edge of his face. "But I do." Nolan's fingers twitched near his sidearm. Marcus noticed, and without a word, shifted his stance slightly. Prepared, coiled, ready to move if the weapon came clear. The silence between them thickened, not uncertain, but heavy with intent. "You let them use our block like a damn experiment," Marcus said. "You stood there and watched while they marked houses, painted threats, fired shots. You didn't stop them. You were tracking them." "I was ordered to," Nolan snapped, and the words came out harder than he meant. "It was part of a program. Domestic Surveillance Initiative 12. We were told to observe networks, map supply lines, identify recruitment cells. Do not intervene. Do not disrupt. Let them operate. Learn the structure." "Until they took federal stockpiles," Marcus said, his voice like stone. "Until they got ahead of you." Nolan said nothing. He took a slow step forward, maybe out of instinct, maybe to re-establish control, but Marcus didn't budge. "You were assigned to monitor them," Marcus continued, his tone colder now, measured. "But you lost control. And when it hit the block, you hid behind the badge. You don't know what you're talking about, Nolan said, though even he didn't sound convinced. Marcus moved first. He closed the distance in 2 steps and slammed Nolan against one of the metal shelves. The impact echoed through the depot, sending a shower of dust from above. Nolan reached for his weapon, but Marcus drove his forearm up beneath Nolan's chin, slamming his head backward into the rack. The gun clattered to the floor and slid out of reach. "You used us," Marcus growled, face inches from his. "You used our people, our kids. You watched and wrote it down like it was all part of some damn field test. You don't understand what they were building," Nolan hissed through clenched teeth. Marcus leaned in closer. "Then tell me." And Nolan did, not willingly, not like someone confessing, but like someone trying to survive. Through gasped breaths and clenched fists, the truth came loose. The gang had been flagged years ago. Raoul Kessler's name had surfaced during a separate operation. The government had begun mapping suspected links between returning veterans and rising domestic extremism. Rather than shut it down, they embedded agents into the fringes, choosing to watch it grow, hoping to capture it when it was big enough to collapse publicly. But it didn't collapse. It spread. It evolved. It absorbed the very systems meant to monitor it. And then it started arming itself with weapons that were never supposed to leave government hands. As Nolan spat blood to the concrete, Marcus reached for his phone, not to make a call, but to end the recording he had started the moment he entered the depot. Hidden camera, audio live, everything Nolan had said. Every word. Captured and stored. He didn't say anything else. He left Nolan where he was, slumped against the wall, bleeding and broken. By the next morning, the footage had been scrubbed clean, backed up 3 different ways, and uploaded through a military-grade encrypted portal to a contact Marcus had once helped extract from a war zone. A woman who now ran an independent investigative channel with a reputation for publishing what others buried. She didn't ask for a name. She didn't need one. By nightfall, the video was live. Leaked footage shows officer confessing to government surveillance of white nationalist group turned domestic terror network. The reaction was instant. News feeds exploded. The footage played across social channels. Protesters filled the courthouse steps by midnight, shouting Marcus's name even though he never gave it. In neighborhoods across the city, people held up printouts of stills from the video. Crates, tags, guns, faces, and though the official response was slow and useless, the people responded fast. They knew. They finally knew. And Marcus, sitting in the dark of his garage, with the lights off and the door open to the wind, didn't feel victory. He felt the calm before the next move. Because this was never just about Nolan. It wasn't even about Royce. It was always Raoul. And Raoul was still waiting. The storm didn't come all at once. It built quietly, like a fuse winding its way toward the powder. Small signs at first, unfamiliar trucks rolling slower than usual past the outer streets, lights off, music dead. A pair of men spotted near the school fence, pretending to look for scrap. Their boots too clean, their eyes too sharp. There was no official alert. No warning from the city. But those who lived close enough to danger could always feel when it was about to bloom. Royce Tatum was preparing for a final strike. His crew had been humiliated, their safe houses exposed. Their operation leaked to the public, and their network cast beneath the hot, unforgiving light of national scrutiny. But Royce wasn't the type to retreat. He was the kind of man who thought retaliation restored control. And this time, he wasn't trying to intimidate. He was trying to erase. The plan was simple and dirty. A coordinated ambush through the alleys running behind Cedar and Pine, timed for just after the neighborhood's evening routines had settled. The idea was to come in fast and loud, scatter fear like buckshot, and leave behind a message louder than any words. But Deshaun saw them first. He had taken Marcus's lessons seriously. How to watch without being seen. How to follow movement without creating it. How to trust the instincts that twitched in your gut, even when you didn't have proof. That night, just past 8, he was walking the perimeter like Marcus had taught him, eyes scanning for irregular rhythms, when he saw the first set of boots moving too quick along the west fence line. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to handle it alone. He pulled out his phone, fired off a text to Marcus, then tapped the call button. They're coming down the alley. 5 of them, 3 masked. One's got a bat. I think that's Royce in the back seat. Marcus. They're moving now. Deshawn's voice had steadied by the second sentence, but Marcus was already moving before it ended. He slammed the toolbox shut, shoved it under the workbench, and crossed the garage in long, deliberate strides. He grabbed the chain from the hook behind the door, looped it once around his fist, and slipped out the back exit into the long shadow of dusk bleeding between the buildings. 2 blocks down, the alley between Pine and McKenna was narrow and choked with trash bins, fence panels, and decades of patchwork repairs. The gang had chosen it for speed, close quarters, fast escape routes, but they hadn't counted on eyes watching from every porch. Nor did they know the entire street had been briefed, trained, and ready. Marcus reached the end of the alley and crouched low behind a rusted generator. From the cover of the shadows, he saw them step out of the truck. 4 men, all armed, no hesitation in their walk. The one in front held a crowbar, dragging it along the brick wall as he passed. Behind him came 2 others with knives drawn. And at the rear, Royce Tatum emerged, shoulders squared, black gloves pulled tight over his hands, and the same smug confidence he wore the night he first rolled onto the block. They weren't here to talk. The moment Royce pointed forward, the others moved. Marcus rose without hesitation. He grabbed the first man by the collar as he passed and yanked him backward into the darkness, slamming him into the brick so hard his legs buckled. The crowbar clanged to the ground. The second came at him with a knife, fast and low. But Marcus sidestepped, grabbed the man's wrist, twisted until the blade dropped, then drove his elbow into the side of the man's neck. Bone cracked. The third tried to rush from the side, swinging a chain, but Marcus caught the momentum, redirected it with a pivot, and flung the man headfirst into a stack of old pallets. Shouts rang out, not from the gang, but from the far end of the alley. Residents emerged from back doors, porch lights flicking on in sync. Janelle appeared beside the old barber's shop with a flashlight in one hand and a wrench in the other. From the opposite end, Mr. Castillo stepped forward with a heavy metal pipe balanced across his shoulder. Deshawn stood between them, chest heaving, holding a bat just like Marcus had taught him. Hands tight, stance steady, eyes fixed. Royce froze. He looked around, realized the alley was no longer a funnel. It was a trap. Marcus stepped into the light now, blood on his knuckles, face streaked with dirt, chain still coiled around his wrist. "You came to finish something," Marcus said, voice low and steady. "But you didn't bring enough men." Royce snarled and lunged. He swung wild, fists full of fury. But Marcus ducked under the punch and delivered a brutal shot to Royce's ribs, then a second to the side of his jaw. Royce staggered, then charged again. The 2 men collided, fists, elbows, knees, slamming into each other with the force of years. Royce managed to land a solid hook to Marcus's side, but Marcus didn't step back. He closed the gap, wrapped both arms around Royce's upper body, and drove him into the side of the alley wall. The concrete cracked behind his shoulder. Royce shouted and broke free, swinging again, this time connecting with Marcus's jaw. A brutal shot that would have dropped another man. Marcus barely flinched. He stepped in, grabbed Royce by the vest, and drove his head into Royce's nose. The gang leader hit the ground hard, blood pouring from his face, limbs twitching from impact. 2 of the other gang members tried to run, but they didn't get far. Deshawn and Mr. Castillo stepped in from opposite ends, closing the alley. The residents didn't need orders. They knew what to do. They moved fast. clean, efficient. Within minutes, 3 of the men were on the ground, zip-tied, their weapons confiscated, breath ragged and panicked. Only the driver escaped, tires squealing as he turned sharp and disappeared into the night, engine howling with retreat. The sirens came late. When the cruisers finally rolled up, blue lights bouncing across the walls, the scene had already been resolved. Marcus stood in the middle of the alley, breathing heavy, one boot planted on the edge of a crowbar, watching as the officers hesitated to cross the line of residents still holding their ground. The arrests were awkward, hands too light, eyes too nervous, but the gang members were hauled off anyway, heads down, faces bloodied. Royce didn't speak as they pulled him into the back of the cruiser. His jaw hung at an unnatural angle. His eyes, however, stayed locked on Marcus. Later that night, the image hit social media, not from a journalist, not from a drone, but from someone on the second floor of a corner apartment. A photo of Marcus standing in the alley surrounded by neighbors, blood on his shirt, the look of a man who had waited too long to be heard. The sun rose to the sound of helicopters and reporters. Cameras circled like a tide finally breaking against a wall they had once ignored. The same media that dismissed early warnings now swarmed outside City Hall, pressing microphones through barricades, their questions chasing a narrative that no longer belonged to them. Protesters lined the streets, not in a haze of rage, but in focused formation, with signs that bore the names of neighborhoods, not slogans. The faces on those sidewalks belonged to people who had lived it, not watched it. This was not a story of awakening. It was a reckoning. Inside a reinforced holding cell at the federal substation, Royce Tatum sat hunched over the edge of a steel bench, wrists cuffed, mouth wired shut, his eyes swollen and dark beneath a tangle of gauze. His lawyers had arrived within hours, but there was little they could salvage. The footage from the alley, the recovered shipment logs, the communication threads linking his gang to caches of military-grade arms, it had all been laid out in hard evidence. Even before the formal arraignment, 24 charges were already confirmed, each one carrying weight: arms trafficking, conspiracy to commit domestic terrorism, racketeering, hate crimes, multiple counts of attempted murder. His pleas would not matter. The empire he had built on fear had collapsed in a single night of resistance. And yet, for Marcus, Royce had never been the real target. The name that had haunted the back end of every encrypted message, that had orchestrated the supply routes, the storage facilities, the recruits pulled from extremist forums and survivalist meetups, the man responsible for building the foundation beneath the chaos, was Raul Kessler. His face hadn't appeared on screen. No camera had captured him speaking. For weeks, he remained a ghost, a shadow hiding behind old call signs and burner threads. But ghosts leave fingerprints. It was during a raid on a small compound tucked into the wooded ridgeline of northern Arkansas that U.S. Marshals recovered a laptop wrapped in canvas, buried beneath insulation inside a false wall. The encryption took days to break. What they found inside wasn't just operational data. It was confession through precision. Raul had documented every detail of the network. He had kept track of resource distribution, of tactical formations taught to new recruits, of identities scrubbed and rerouted through shell companies tied to private contractors. He hadn't been hiding from the government. He had believed they wouldn't come, but they did. Marcus wasn't there for the takedown. He didn't need to be. He had already seen Raul's work firsthand. In the silence of the block after a shooting, in the markings scrawled across garage doors, in the crates filled with rifles that never should have left federal soil. When word came through that Raul Kessler had been captured outside a closed-down munitions depot near the Louisiana border, unarmed, traveling with forged credentials, Marcus didn't cheer. He simply nodded and went back to work. Raul didn't fight extradition. He remained silent through the entire booking process, said nothing during transfer, and only raised his head once, during arraignment, when he noticed the row of cameras waiting like vultures near the courtroom door. For the first time in a decade, his name appeared in a headline alongside his face. Indictments followed rapidly. Federal prosecutors unveiled an extensive case file, aided by the encrypted data Marcus had exposed. Raul was charged with directing an unregistered paramilitary force, coordinating arms transfers across state lines, and actively undermining domestic infrastructure. But there was more. They charged him with treason. Not symbolic, not political, but tactical. The kind that sticks when the receipts show you outfitted violent extremists with weapons of war. He was denied bail. His trial was expedited. He was convicted on all counts. Back in the city, the story unfolded block by block. Officer Nolan was arrested after being caught on camera trying to destroy sensitive materials in a rented storage unit just outside the jurisdiction. His charges included destruction of evidence, perjury, and willful obstruction of a federal investigation. He did not resist arrest. He did not make a statement. His badge was removed in the presence of internal affairs, and his name became shorthand for every officer who had chosen loyalty to power over duty to people. The gang crumbled without its leaders. Those who weren't arrested scattered into hiding. A coordinated sweep across multiple counties netted half a dozen former enforcers. The others vanished, no longer bold enough to threaten a community that had chosen to stand together, not flinch. Marcus watched it all unfold from his place on the porch. He didn't seek out the press, but when they came, when they blocked off the street and aimed their lenses at the garage, he stepped out and gave them what they came for. Not glory, not spectacle, just truth. "I didn't do this alone," Marcus said, standing beneath the mural wall that now stretched nearly the full length of the block, filled with handprints, initials, and faces that had fought without needing recognition. "No one here did. We stood because no one else would, and we'll keep standing. Not because we're brave, but because we're together." He didn't wait for applause. He turned, walked back to the garage, and continued rebuilding a carburetor he had left half open on the bench. 2 days later, a representative from the Department of Homeland Security arrived with a contract, a consulting position, full security clearance, national coordination, high compensation, a chance to shape future response protocols. Marcus heard him out, then declined. He had no interest in becoming a face for federal policy. He didn't need to be flown to D.C. to tell people what justice should look like. He had seen what it looked like already. It was Deshawn rewiring porch lights for the elders down the street. It was Janelle organizing self-defense workshops in the church basement. It was Miss Eunice pulling weeds from a garden where bullet casings had once been found. Marcus didn't want a title. He wanted peace, rooted in the same ground they once tried to burn. The mornings sounded different now. Not because the world had changed overnight, but because the block had learned how to listen to itself again. Gone were the sirens echoing in the distance, the nervous silences behind drawn curtains, the slow roll of tinted trucks daring someone to speak. In their place came the rhythms of new life, the bounce of basketballs against pavement, laughter ringing out from behind chain-link fences, the soft scrape of brushes on brick as another layer of mural bloomed into color. It had been months since the alley standoff, months since the cameras left, since the headlines moved on, since the trials delivered their sentences, and the city held its breath to see what came next. But the block didn't wait for anyone's permission to begin again. It had already started. Children raced bikes down the same sidewalks that had once been walked in fear. Now scuffed with chalk drawings and challenge lines, porch radios played gospel and soul, sometimes fading into jazz or sharp trumpet notes from a window upstairs. The barber shop had repainted its front awning. The corner store now kept the lights on after sunset. The alley once used for ambush now held flower beds, small and uneven, but thriving all the same. The mural wall stretched longer than anyone had planned. At first, it had been just handprints and names, a statement of presence. Now it held faces, painted by young artists from the neighborhood. Marcus's was among them, though he hadn't agreed to it. He never stood still long enough to pose, so they painted him from memory. Not just how he looked, but how he moved, shoulders squared, hands ready, standing slightly off-center because he never wanted to be the first thing you saw. He had lost weight, not by choice, not from any need to prove himself, but from the rhythm of labor, repairing fences, lifting engines, training those who wanted to learn how to defend, how to rebuild, how to last. He moved quieter these days, but there was strength in his steps, not tension. The kind of peace a man carries when he's chosen his place, and no longer questions why. Deshaun had just left for orientation that morning, community college, full scholarship, mechanical design program. Marcus had driven him there himself, walked the edge of the campus with him, made sure he knew how to move without looking over his shoulder. When they said goodbye, Deshaun didn't say much. He just nodded, once, the way Marcus used to. Miss Eunice had returned to teaching, not in a school, but at the community center, where she led weekend classes on local Black history, civil rights, and the stories the textbooks left out. She brought her old chalkboard from the basement, cleaned it herself, and wrote one sentence across the top in bold white script. Knowing your story makes you impossible to erase. Inside the garage, Marcus worked on a '97 Caprice, worn but steady, the kind of car that had history. He wiped the grease from his fingers and leaned back just as the afternoon light hit the mural. His eyes settled on the row of faces, then drifted toward the kids playing basketball across the street, toward the teenagers painting the final stretch of the wall, toward the porch where Janelle sat, reading aloud to a group of younger boys who hadn't yet learned how to sit still. He smiled, not because everything was perfect, but because everything was alive. The block hadn't just survived, it had woken up. I hope you enjoyed that story. Please share it with your friends and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. In the meantime, I have handpicked 2 stories for you that I think you will enjoy. Have a great day.